Well, confession time.
Okay.
I must confess, as I want to do, that before I joined Quality Digest and learned about this incredible, fascinating industry of ours, I had very little knowledge of or appreciation for statistics, other than critical bits of knowledge, of course, such as Major League Baseball's highest single-season batting average, or the career leader in pitching wins.
There you go.
Stuff that you got to know. I mean, you got to know that stuff.
You just got to know that stuff.
I mean, of course. But exposure, however, to the writings of the very wise Donald Wheeler and the brilliant Davis Balstracci, among others, gave me some really good basic insights into the power of statistical process control, especially, as Davis likes to say, if you simply plot the dots of a process. Just plot the dots and see what's happening in real time as things are happening. And that's really important to know, I think, and keep in mind. Well, the 2016 presidential campaign and my increased reliance on Nate Silver's exceptional website, 538.com, I've mentioned it on the show, I know I've mentioned it to you, Dirk. That website helped me really make sense of and further inform my outlook for the uses of data. 538.com looks at politics and economics, social issues, sports, and a lot more, all from a purely statistical perspective. So kind of slice and dice data to reveal the truths hidden within, and I think it's really valuable to do that. Well, the core of 538.com's campaign analysis this past cycle lay within the hundreds and hundreds of state and national polls that came out kind of on a weekly basis that Silver and his team interpreted. All polls were included and weighted accordingly to present the most balanced possible picture of what was going on in the state of the campaign. Now, I emphasize all polls because Silver's models even considered such wacky polls as the UCS Dornsife LA Times Daybreak tracking poll, which consistently predicted that Donald Trump would win the election. In this,
they were obviously wrong.
I was going to say, the Daybreak poll obviously was an outlier, it was a true outlier, and many a 538.com reader complained about its inclusions in Silver's overall model, which correspondingly gave Trump a much better chance of victory than practically any other poll aggregator. Imagine that.
Yeah.
You know, he included in this one poll and some others that were also outliers, and because of that, his model showed that Trump had not a great chance. His models, I think, showed Trump had like a 35% chance of winning.
Right.
Others had like as little as single digits or less,
right?
Low single digits as we went into November 8th. Well, Silver's admonition to those who doubted why he would include the Daybreak poll came down to a data analysis heresy that I hadn't previously heard of before, namely the evils of herding. I don't know if you've heard of that one. Herding. Okay. This is the tactic in which pollsters begin to kind of game their data, selectively pruning away outliers and generally falling into a very narrow range of expected outcomes. They do this in unison, and they do it at least, I think, semi-unconsciously, but getting rid of the outliers, those opinions that run counter to the consensus of the conventional wisdom, can severely reduce the effectiveness of your data analysis, and sometimes, as in the case of the 2016 presidential election, it can result in some really incorrect projections. Okay, all of which is a very long introduction to an article.
That was an introduction?
That was an introduction to an article. Very long introduction to an article that we ran in Tuesday's issue of the Quality Digest newsletter titled Question the Consensus of Experts. And it was written, as you can see right there, by Anil Gaba, and it originally appeared on the very excellent InSeed Knowledge blog. Well, Gaba's article underlines and supports this fear that I just mentioned of herding, particularly in a business environment in which leaders have to make some forward-thinking decisions, of course, often based on backward-looking data. As the article's subhead says, just because all experts agree doesn't make them right. Herding.
Right.
Is exactly what herding is all about. In fact, this kind of herding, as we mentioned, is often a more powerful indicator that an analysis is wrong. Experts who have similar backgrounds and outlooks, when presented with the same data, will generally reach the same or very, very similar conclusions. For a leader, gauging those opinions and trying to make a decision, it might appear that expert agreement is a strong indicator that a proposed course is the right one, of course. But without outliers presenting vastly different points of view, the degree of uncertainty over a chosen action can easily be understated, and that can lead to costly mistakes. Understand what he's saying there, is that if you're just looking at what the experts say, and they're telling you a story and you're making a decision based on that, if you're not at least considering what those outliers on the margins are saying as well, you're going to have a much greater chance of being wrong, of making a wrong decision. Not to say that you've got to chuck out what the experts are saying. They have good reason for being experts, but understand what the broad range of opinion is, because it's on the margins where many times the truth can be indicated, not necessarily spoken, but at least there's indications that there's other viewpoints. That's very important to do.
Right.
Now, the moral of the story is, I think, is that caution is always warranted, and that those straying from the consensus of the experts should always be considered strongly. You got to probe those contrarians for the reasons why, and you got to really do everything you can to punch holes in the arguments of those so-called experts. Now, you may still choose to go with the conventional wisdom, but at least you're going to have considered all viewpoints and move forward with a kind of a better sense of what could go wrong. I mean, this is really an example of risk-based thinking at its finest. And I want to close with an example that wasn't mentioned in the article, but came to me as I was reading this and thinking about herding. Do you ever hear of a guy by the name of George Ball?
No.
Okay. George Ball was kind of an obscure diplomat politician in the 60s. He was the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Agricultural Affairs. It looks like he was a relatively minor political figure, but he was at the edges of discussions about the escalation in Vietnam during 1965. Now, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Dean Rusk, many higher profile foreign policy experts were all in the tank to say, no, we've got to, as America, we've got to go forcefully into Vietnam, support the South Vietnamese government, and make our stand. We've got to stand up against communism. But Ball was very much a doubter. He was very much a contrarian there. And he said, well, why? What really is at risk here? Why are we doing this? Why are we going to commit American prestige to this? Now, nobody really listened to him, to be honest. I mean, Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't listen to him. McNamara and McGeorge Bundy went out of their way to discredit him. But as history showed, Ball was right. Now, Ball was like the only one in that whole council who was saying this. And I mean, he was listened to, he was politely listened to, but nobody really took what he was saying seriously. But as it turned out, LBJ needed to say, well, what is George saying? And go to McGeorge Bundy and go to Dean Rusk and go to McNamara and say, is what he's saying, does that make sense?
Yeah, should we consider that?
Should we consider that as an outlier opinion? They didn't, but if they did, things might have gone very differently in the 1960s.
And it's funny. I mean, even now, just briefly. I mean, we talk about fake news and stuff, and sometimes we'll see something that we don't like, and we'll call it fake news before we've actually really verified that it's fake news. And very often you'll find that sometimes some of these really outrageous things that we may hear or read, when you look into them, you find, well, it's outrageous, but it isn't necessarily fake. And I think it's important sometimes to weigh all those things, which is getting harder and harder to do in some ways, because we're kind of being deluged sometimes now with messages that are unclear whether they're real or not. But you do have to kind of suss them out and go, do I need to consider this opinion?
Well, this is the indicator, and this is where it takes a lot of self-reflection as a leader who has to make a decision. You have to ask yourself, am I going into this decision with a preconceived notion? Am I trying to find data that suits what my preconceived notion is? And if you have to be honest. If you are, you've got to chuck that. You've got to do your best to chuck it. That doesn't mean that you consider more the contrarian opinion because you're trying to go the other direction too much. But you need to be aware if you have a preconceived bias on an answer going in, because if you have an answer in mind and you can cherry pick the data to support that, you're going to go wrong, almost certainly.